This is Nathaniel Cogley. Welcome to Cogley and Morrow on Politics. My co-host, Dr. Eric Morrow, is not available this week, so we brought in a special guest, Dr. Kabala, into the studio, everyone. Bolek, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Dr. Kabala studies federal government. He's also been teaching Texas government here at Tarleton State University. It's been great to have you here, a real expert. You did your undergraduate at Harvard and your graduate studies at Yale, so
That's
really
right.
Quite a nice pedigree you have coming down here.
No, it's been a great experience in the classroom, and happy to be at Tarleton.
Well, certainly we've had a lot of headline news on impeachments. The House is moving to impeach President Trump. We're expecting a floor vote on that coming up. Impeachment is something very interesting, very important for the checks and balances between the three branches in the Constitution, a very significant moment. But this has become a very partisan environment here. It's headline news. People are studying it. And there's actually only been 2 impeachments of presidents in the United States history. It's going to be Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton. We believe President Nixon was about to be impeached, and he resigned before that was possible. So we have 3 previous cases to look into. President Trump is the 4th that we have a significant case to look at. And of course, we'll see how that plays out. A lot of people differ on what's going on, the headline news. But what we wanted to bring you into the studio to talk about is the Andrew Johnson case, which was the first time a president was impeached in the United States of America. And I think there's a lot of interesting parallels here where we can learn some lessons from this case.
Sure.
So I'm no expert on this time period. I think you know it better than me, but my understanding is President Lincoln wins in 1860. Of course, the Civil War is sparked, but President Lincoln originally had a fellow Republican vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, and so it was a solid Republican administration. As President Lincoln is going up for his reelection, Hannibal Hamlin is dropped from the ticket, and Lincoln looks as his second term is going to be a term of national unity, trying to put the Union back together, get the southern states back on board. And so he drops fellow Republican Hannibal Hamlin from the ticket, and he puts a Democrat on the ticket. So you have a Republican in the presidential slot and a Democrat in the vice presidential slot, and this is presented as a national unity ticket. Let the southern states, we have a Democratic Southerner like you on the ticket. And so this is done, in my limited understanding, symbolically in the election process to try to bring the Union together.
That's right.
President Lincoln did not know he was actually appointing the next president of the United States. So after he's inaugurated for his second term in 1865, we get the Lincoln assassination. President Johnson becomes president in an environment where the Republican Party dominates Congress. Many southern states are still not fully readmitted into the Union and don't even have representation in the Senate and maybe the House. And so you get a Democratic president in a time where the Republican Party dominates Congress, and they just fought a very bitter civil war.
Sure.
So I'm just setting the stage here. You get a President Johnson with a Republican Congress. We can predict tension. Now, this is going to play out a certain way. So what is this dispute that arises between President Johnson and the Republican Congress?
Sure. Where you had more than one dimension, I would suggest there was a personality clash for sure, and there was also a policy disagreement. So on a personal level, it's interesting. There was actually an earlier attempt to impeach then President Johnson. This starts in 1866. The attempt doesn't make it out of the Judiciary Committee. But so the personal dimension, Johnson shows up at his inauguration, and he seems like he's inebriated. He's not making friends. So that's going on. There's also a disagreement about the terms on which former Confederate states should be readmitted into the Union. And this is where Johnson really disagrees with radical Republicans in the Congress and with President Lincoln, who wanted to be who wanted to see the formerly Confederate states readmitted quicker. But Johnson goes beyond that and actually communicates he wants the U.S. to be a white nation going forward. And he is willing to readmit formerly Confederate governments back into the U.S. at the state level, even when it's clear there's not a commitment to civil rights.
So that's got to be hard for the Republican Party. They just fought and basically won a civil war, and now we get a Democrat president from the South who would like, as you say, quote unquote, white nation,
Yep.
and to admit the former Confederate states back into the Union immediately.
That's
Whereas
right.
the Republicans just fought a war over this, and now all of a
That's
sudden
exactly
the commander in chief wants to do the opposite. This has to be very difficult.
Very difficult. And so you start to see what are known as black codes come back in as early as 1866, 1867. Former Confederates have the sense that Andrew Johnson is on their side. So this really starts to build. And another policy disagreement, President Johnson, immediately after assuming the office, starts to purge Lincoln's cabinet. And he's specifically getting rid of radical Republicans who are committed to Reconstruction. And so this is where Congress passes a law that leads to the impeachment crisis, right? So, yeah.
So that is an interesting point, because we think in terms of this conflict between the president and the Congress, but there's also this natural conflict between the president and his own cabinet, right? The cabinet's
That's right.
part of the executive branch, and he inherits Lincoln's cabinet.
That's right.
But politically, he's very different.
Not only do you have a Democratic president, a Republican candidate, but then you also have radical Republicans in the cabinet, and those are the ones that President Johnson really, the word is purging. I mean, he's getting rid of them left and right.
So it seems like there'd be naturally some policy disagreements. You already mentioned some big picture disagreements that would exist between the Johnson administration and the Congress and even his own cabinet that he inherited from Lincoln. Right. What becomes the specific issue that's going to drive this impeachment effort against President Johnson?
Sure. So it wasn't just the threshold. It wasn't just what percentage in a formerly Confederate state needs to now pledge loyalty to the Union. It specifically came down to Ed Stanton, who was Secretary of War. And he's the last sort of member of the cabinet, a radical Republican. It's clear President Johnson wants to get rid of him. Congress passes a law to protect Ed Stanton and prevent President Johnson from being able to remove him. It's called the Tenure of Office Act, and immediately after it passes, President Johnson vetoes it. Congress passes it over his veto. President Johnson goes ahead, fires Ed Stanton, Secretary of War, anyway, and that triggers the impeachment crisis.
So he wanted to remove Lincoln, the Secretary of War that Lincoln had put in there.
That's right.
And maybe replace him with his own appointee, which would have to go through the Senate, as we know. But is there any precedent at this point about the ability of a president to terminate a Secretary of War? I guess especially if they're not following their policies or they're not working according to the president.
Sure. Well, this is where it was assumed. There hadn't been this kind of test before, but it had been assumed constitutionally that a president is well within his rights. This is presidential prerogative to retain or get or fire a member of the cabinet. So this was a first. This was Congress asserting itself in a pretty unprecedented way. The Supreme Court goes on in the 1920s to vindicate Andrew Johnson and held that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional. So in that respect, Johnson is later vindicated.
But it seems at this point what we have here is a law out of the Congress, but the Johnson administration is perhaps thinking that law is not constitutional because it's intruding on the executive branch, intruding on his ability to be the commander-in-chief and appoint his own Secretary of War. Do I have that right?
That's right, and that's separate from the issue of the kinds of governments that Johnson is seeking to readmit. This was a separate constitutional issue.
All right, so this is going to build up, and I think the House goes full bore here against Johnson. I think there's, we're going to discuss later in the show how there's 2 pending articles of impeachment against President Trump. Not against President Johnson. There were 11. Wow, that's a lot. Can you tell us about that?
Not just 11, but the House appointed 7 managers to make the case. So these individuals included Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts, John Bingham of Ohio. Managers go on to continue to make the case in the Senate. This is an all-out effort to remove the president.
Yeah, and some of these are kind of very vague and interesting. I mean, we have the more specific ones that are targeting, removing a Secretary of War, replacing a Secretary of War, not following the Tenure of Office Act. But then we have some really vague ones. So like number 11, which actually will come up for a vote later, bringing disgrace and ridicule to the presidency by his aforementioned words and actions.
Right. And so this is where some of the inauguration behavior, some of these
interesting.
personality issues come into play. It doesn't take away from the fact that the House does appear petty in using that as an article of impeachment. But again, Johnson had not helped himself.
Yeah. And then another one, making 3 speeches with intent to, quote unquote, attempt to bring into disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach the Congress of the United States. Very vague language.
Very vague.
11 of these. So this goes to, they bring all 11 charges to a vote in the House, and we're going to see that it passes big. It looks like it has 126 in support with only 47 against. That would be a massive vote in support.
That's right, 126 to 47. So this is 1868. There's no question this passes the House.
Yeah, and it looks like at that time, of course, it's not an even balance between Republicans and Democrats. The Republicans dominate because, once again, not all the Democratic states in the South had been readmitted and had representation. I think there were actually 147 Republicans, 44 Democrats at the time, and 4 independents.
That's right.
And so we get a vote of 126 to 47 with 17 abstaining from this. Yeah,
right. And so, of course, impeachment is a political question. It's not spelled out precisely in the criminal or civil code what constitutes an impeachable offense. And Johnson, really, there was a policy disagreement, but the House does appear somewhat partisan, drawing up 11 articles of impeachment and including some of the vague provisions that you mentioned.
Yeah, and partisanship in a time where the party really dominates a chamber,
right,
is a bit different than with a narrow majority. So
exactly.
they pass these 11, and it's got to go over to the Senate. And so can you talk first about how that trial is conducted? Right now we're looking, as this thing moves to the House on President Trump and maybe goes to the Senate, there's a lot of talk about what's the trial going to look like. So the Johnson case can maybe get some insight into what's happened in the past. How did they handle that trial situation in the Senate? Sure.
So similar setup constitutionally in terms of the individual who presides over that Senate trial is the Justice of the Supreme Court. So that's Salmon Chase at the time. 7 managers from the House, successful attempt to impeach the president, continue to make the case in the Senate. So we're talking about Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts here, James Bingham from Ohio, James Wilson, and others. And they make the case that the president needs to be removed. Now, the president gets to defend himself at this point. This is an actual trial, not just the House making the case to remove. And so who's helping President Johnson at this point? It's his Attorney General, Henry Stanberry, the Secretary of State, William Seward, who's got a machine in New York, is doing some work behind the scenes. And so the president actually does mount a sophisticated constitutional defense to say this is more about personality. It does not involve a legitimate constitutional issue. And despite all that, as you know, the vote in the Senate was very close.
Yeah, and so let's look at these numbers here. We see that the vote is going to be 35 yays. Well, first of all, they bring 3 articles to a vote, not all 11. So they bring Article 2, appointing Thomas Secretary of War ad interim, and then 3, appointing Thomas without required advice and consent to the Senate and bringing disgrace and ridicule to the presidency. They're going to bring these 3 different articles at 3 different stages to a vote. They all pass at a vote of 35 to 19. If I'm correct, that's 54 senators representing 27 states. And at that time, there are 10 other states that do not have representation in the Senate. Do I have that right?
That's right.
Okay, and if we break down this vote of 35 to 19, it's a percentage of 65%. And my understanding, you need 2/3 to convict and remove. So they seem to be 1 vote shy.
We're talking literally 1 vote shy of removing a president. So this is the closest that it's ever come.
And it looks like as we look at this breakdown, the 9 Democratic senators all defend Johnson. None of them break ranks. But within the Republican Party, you have 45 senators, and there are 10 of them that break there. Only 35 vote to impeach. 10 Republican senators vote not guilty, and therefore they're 1 vote shy. What might have been the thinking of those 10 that break from the 45 Republican Republican senators.
That's right. So this is interesting, and it speaks to that disagreement you had in the Republican Party during Reconstruction. Radical Republicans, on the one hand, wanting to move as fast as possible in terms of restructuring formerly Confederate society, insisting on a maximum number of former Confederate officials pledging allegiance to the Union as the price of readmission. You did have some non-radical Republicans, so to speak, some moderates who were more in line with the approach Lincoln wanted to take. And my bet is those are the kinds of Republicans who were not on board with this impeachment effort.
All right, interesting. And so he's going to stay in office. He's going to be able to finish out his term. This was obviously a big dramatic moment in the American politics at that time.
It's the closest it ever came.
Yeah. Were there any winners out of this? We have the Congress pushing for the impeachment of Johnson, defending himself, surviving by one vote. Did anyone win out of this whole process?
Well, this is where I would argue there might be some analogies to the contemporary situation. My answer is no winners. If you look at what happens to President Johnson's political career, he does not get reelected. Interestingly, he does get reelected back to the Senate from Tennessee, so he can point to that. But whenever people bring up President Johnson today, it's inevitably in the context of impeachment. Nothing else gets accomplished in his presidential term. He doesn't win in any sense, despite the acquittal. On the Republican side, if you look at the individuals who were involved in making the case that he should be removed, not a lot of clear winners there either. So these 7 House managers, if you look at examples, include Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts, John Bingham from Ohio, James Wilson. Their political careers in the 1870s tarnished by scandals. They don't go on to really accomplish anything significant either. So that's a fair assessment. Alan Guelzo, noted historian of this period, has also concluded there's really no winners.
So no winners out of a partisan impeachment that it doesn't even get the job done.
How about that?
How about that? And so going forward, I think the Johnson case is interesting, and I'm wondering your thoughts on it, because he's not held up as a great U.S. president.
Right.
He's pretty low on historians' rankings of job performance, but historians have kind of looked back on this impeachment and seen it as improper. Can you speak to that?
I think given the... Yes, and also an analogy is look how close it was to the next presidential election. We're not talking about the beginning of his presidential term. I think if you look at the fact that out of the 11 initial articles of impeachment, most of them did not have to do with constitutional issues. That's one reason why most people today would say it was improper. Most historians, it had to do with personality, not constitutional issues. The Supreme Court goes on to vindicate Andrew Johnson in the 1920s and holds that the Tenure of Office Act was actually unconstitutional. So that's another contributing factor. Congress asserted itself beyond what the Constitution envisions. The president does need to be able to control who's in the cabinet.
So as you are speaking, and we're trying to, of course, this is a good topic for today's show because of the current situation. I just marked some takeaways, and I'll mention them, and you can give me any comments if you have on them. Some takeaways here. One, a very partisan environment. We seem to be in that in the U.S. right now. The trial procedures, people are kind of questioning what's the trial going to look like. What's interesting here, they only voted on 3 and supposedly didn't vote on the other 8. And that's been a topic of discussion. Does McConnell even have to have a trial, or can he dismiss? We see that the side prosecuting the president broke in their votes, not the side defending their president. That'd be interesting as we look forward to our Senate trial with President Trump. No winners. I mean, are we going to have winners in this situation? Right. And another thing that I've noticed is this seems to be an impeachment about whether or not the president can do his job. Trump was doing his job in terms of trying to enforce a treaty on assistance in criminal matters with Ukraine, requesting an investigation. Right. He's also temporarily deferring funds in the fiscal year, another job. But the Congress is saying you can't do your job that way. We don't like the decisions. And maybe they have a legitimate concern about his decision making, but these are within his job scope. And we assume a president in his job scope can also fire a Secretary of War. So just looking at what you presented presented here is kind of what some interesting takeaways are. Any thoughts or observations as I went through that list?
No, I agree with all of that. And I would just alongside that mention the proximity to an election. Gouverneur Morris at the Constitutional Convention speculated that impeachment would always be a risky approach for whoever is initiating it, just because the American people prefer to have these policy disagreements out at the ballot box. Right? So the fact that we're very close in 1868 to the next presidential election and the Congress doesn't wait for that election, that contributes to the impeachment effort not being successful. I think that might be an analogy here. Again, it doesn't suggest there weren't legitimate policy disagreements. Just the question that comes up is, do the American people prefer to resolve those democratically at the ballot box as opposed to in an impeachment proceeding?
Well, that's very interesting, very relevant today. Some people are saying, let's just have the election. Let's decide this at the ballot box. So a very interesting time for us to take a look at this Andrew Johnson case and relevance. We really thank you for coming on. I'm going to ask you to stick through the break. Maybe you want to chime in as I have some things to say on the current impeachment process going on. Cogley and Morrow on politics right after the break.
The home of Essential Jazz with Hank Jones and Mike Pierce. This is 90.5 KTRL FM, Stephenville.
This is the story of a very special woman. Just a few knew about her superpowers. In a matter of seconds, she turned herself into a great mathematician. She masqueraded as a regular person at work, but as a superhero at home. Everyone knows her as Gabriella. I still call her Mom.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need to help, complete with tips and resources at aarp.org/caregiving. Brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
Explore where the dinosaurs roamed at Dinosaur Valley State Park in Glen Rose. You can hike, explore, and see footprints left behind by the dinosaurs that once roamed there. The park offers guided tours, lush and expansive trails, and you can even bring your own horse to ride through the more than 100 acres. For more information or to ask about volunteering, visit tpwd.texas.gov and click Find a Park.
The home of Beatles and Beyond with Momen Cosby. This is KTRL 90.5 FM, Tarleton State University Radio.
We're shaking the baby now. Shaking our baby. Twist and shout. Twist and
Welcome back to Cogley and Morrow on Politics. Dr. Morrow is not with us today, and Dr. Kabala has graciously agreed to stick around and help me out fill up this hour on some of his interesting observations concerning the current impeachment process underway.
Good to be here.
We're lucky to have you. One thing interesting is there was a time back in March, Nancy Pelosi said she wouldn't be moving on articles of impeachment unless there was bipartisan support and the evidence was overwhelming and compelling. She appears to be moving forward now. Some people want her to do that. Some people support this, right. But it's certainly not bipartisan. This is certainly the partisan lines are very sharp on this. And the evidence hasn't convinced everyone. I mean, they had those 4 scholars in the Judiciary Committee. 3 of them were saying move, but then Jonathan Turley was very opposed to this, and he's a very important scholar on this. So it doesn't seem like the evidence is overwhelming for everyone or bipartisan, but we're moving forward anyway. So I have this theory. I was wondering if you had any thoughts. I think what's happening here is the inquiry was itself designed to be an investigation and gain information. And there might have been genuine concerns about decision-making and stuff like that. But to move forward now where nobody thinks Trump's going to be convicted and removed in the Senate. And it's tough. It's always been tough for her to put 31 Democratic members of the House from Trump districts having a vote on whether or not to impeach the president that the district chose in a presidential election year. That's always been tough. And you would think, why would she do that to those 31 if there's actually no chance?
Well, and she resisted for such a long time.
She resisted. She was very patient and she resisted. But in my theory, what's going on here is the person making decisions here is not 235 Democrats. It's the speaker. She controls the agenda. And the politics behind being speaker, you need so many things to happen. You need to win your home district. You need to have support of your party, and you need your party to keep a majority. And she's got to juggle all these things. And we've been thinking of her as the moderate, patient, governing Democrat. She's from San Francisco. By the way, I'm from San Francisco.
Is that right?
Yeah. I grew up middle school, high school, one of my two hometowns. I love San Francisco. I still go back there sometimes. But the politics of San Francisco is not the politics of Erath County, right? So San Francisco is one of the most Democratic districts in the country. This media constant attention on this impeachment and the framing has it to the point where 83% of Democrats think he should be impeached.
Right.
And the politics of San Francisco, it's hard for her to continue to be seen as the obstacle to impeachment, that he should be impeached, but the speaker won't bring it to the floor in her district where there's so many Democrats. San Francisco has a very interesting top two system. So in the November ballot, it's not going to be the Republican nominee versus Democratic nominee, in which case she wins. All the candidates are on the same ballot in March. Top two go to the final in November. She's never faced a fellow Democrat in the November election as her only opponent, but it was close last time. There was only 1,175 votes away from having a fellow Democrat opponent in November, and not just any Democrat, a Bernie Sanders supporting Democratic Socialist.
How about that?
And that district, Bernie's pretty popular.
Yep.
Bernie's a candidate. She's 79 years old. And I just think the politics of her home district have gotten to her. We're getting this close to that first round primary in California. She's got to move on this. She can't be seen by her district as being the obstacle to impeachment.
So you think had she not brought this process, had she not lent her support to impeachment, she was looking at a serious primary challenge in her district?
Yeah, I would. Well, we're looking at if she doesn't consolidate, if she consolidates Democratic support now, number two can be a Republican with about 10%.
Okay.
And then she faces the Republican in November and defeats him easily. But if she loses like another 10% of Democrats or another 15% of Democrats, number two could be a fellow Democrat in at 12%.
Okay.
So I'm not saying it should be on everyone's radar right now, but California, even if you have a majority on the first ballot, you don't win. It's about the top two go to the November ballot.
Interesting.
So even if a fellow Democratic Socialist, and there's a gentleman, he has a Stanford law degree. He came in third place last time. He was the one 1,000 votes away from qualifying. Democratic Socialist, Stanford law degree. Doesn't look like the optics are the best, but he's articulate. He flows. I mean, he's able to make the Democratic Socialist case. He's going hard. There's another impressive young lady who has another degree from Stanford. She's very interesting and compelling. And it could be either of these people. But if they're able to come in second place, and again, not second place with 30%, 40%, second place with 12%.
Just close enough. And you've written about this in the Washington Examiner. Is that right? I mean, I've really found your articles on this interesting.
Well, thank you very much. I've written on the Impoundment Control Act in the Examiner. My Pelosi op-ed did not yet. We're still circulating that one.
Well, it will happen. That will get published. So. But so you're saying there's a rationality to her initiating this process connected to electoral considerations in her home district. It's not irrational. She's behaving in a rational. She's making rational choices.
I think she definitely wants the party to do well. She wants those 31 Democrats from Trump districts to do well. She wants Democrats in the Senate to do well. She wants the Democratic presidential candidates to do well. She wants it all to do well. She's on Team Democrat, but priority is number one. Yeah?
Okay.
You have a number one priority, and it's yourself, and it's your own reelection. And I think she thinks she has to, because of her district politics, she has to move on this. She can't be seen as the obstacle of impeachment. That she has to do it for herself, and also that she can still survive as Speaker going forward doing this, because it'll satisfy the other members in the Democratic House that also themselves need to move on impeachment and need to tell their voters they'll support the Speaker because she's moving on impeachment.
Right.
And also those 31 Democrats from Trump districts, they can vote no. There can be a mix. And they can do a different vote for their district.
Emphasizing
she's not,
conscience.
quote unquote, whipping the 31.
She's not, yeah.
Yeah. So that's my thoughts. Any thoughts? Do I have that one right or wrong?
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. If I could actually ask you about that, tying it specifically to Nancy Pelosi's electoral prospects in her home district, how are those affected if the Senate trial, as appears to be the case, goes nowhere. I mean, does that help her or hurt her in her district in California? Is that a wash? You're saying the possibility of her being seen as on the sidelines, not allowing for impeachment to go forward, would have been more detrimental to her in California. But what if the inevitable happens and nothing takes place in the Senate? Doesn't that hurt her back home in her district?
No, because her district is way far Democrat. They'll say that
She
went
tried.
forward. She
Okay.
tried, and
She did
she'll
her
say
best.
the Republicans obstructed in the Senate, and they just overlooked the facts. And
Okay.
she had the integrity to go forward. And I mean, it's just the key here. Who's going to be number 2 on that March 3rd ballot in California? If it's a
Interesting.
Republican, she wins re-election.
Right.
It's a wrap.
Yeah.
Nothing else matters. San Francisco's not going to vote for a Republican because the trial in the Senate didn't go well.
Okay.
You know,
so
I
you're
mean-
saying the disenchantment, the frustration with her, the way she managed the impeachment process, you don't see that spilling over into a vote for a Bernie Sanders-like candidate?
San Francisco voters will only have 2 choices come November. If it's Nancy Pelosi or a Republican, she wins. Nothing else matters. It's a lock.
Makes sense.
But if it's her versus a Democratic Socialist, we haven't seen that before. She hasn't faced that before. But we've had it in California and other races. 2
Yeah.
Democrats in the final. It can definitely happen.
Well, that position is being articulated in the Democratic Party now. Can I ask you about there had been some speculation that a vote might not even take place in the House, that there was just a strategic consideration here for Democrats in terms of dragging out a process, but then not see the attempt go down to defeat. How certain are you, percentage-wise, that an impeachment vote actually takes place in the House?
Yeah, so we've seen some reports come out that some of these 31 Democrats from Trump districts have floated the idea of, instead of doing impeachment, do a censure.
Yeah.
But
Interesting.
and that might be better for the politics of their district. The only thing is none of them are speaker. None of those 31 Democrats from Trump districts
San
are
Francisco
speaker.
voters. Yeah.
That might be wise for them. It might be wise for the party. Nancy Pelosi, speaker. She's from San Francisco. The chairs of the committee are from New York City, L.A. They're going to go forward. So I think why that might be wise, and it's definitely something to entertain, and it could, in a different scenario, be the thing for the party to do. Pelosi's indicated she's going forward, and that's a wrap. I mean, she's going to go forward, and it
Right.
makes sense for her district. So I definitely think the vote's coming.
So some of these moderate Democrats who might prefer not to see it happen, we're talking about Van Drew in New Jersey. I mean, there were 2 Democrats, is that right, who voted against opening up a formal inquiry. So they would prefer, you're saying, a censure resolution.
Yeah, so we already saw 2 Democrats break ranks from that 31. And what they broke ranks on was voting for the rules for the public hearings, a resolution, I believe, 660, that authorized public hearings on impeachment. Yeah, so Representative Colin Peterson in western Minnesota from a Trump district, he voted no on that. And then Representative Jefferson Van Drew, who's been more vocal in the media, he's totally against this. He's from New Jersey, southern New Jersey.
And he's interesting to me in terms of the electoral calculation, because I think his district overlaps with Atlantic City. Is that right? And his district has benefited from Trump businesses in the past being involved there.
Yeah, and I think Trump won that district by 5 points.
That's right.
You know, and he was able to win a Trump district. It's good for the Democrats. They have a Democrat winning in a Trump district. And so, but they should want him to win. But this is a tough vote for him. And he's all in on this is improper. This shouldn't take place.
Right.
So we've only seen 2 break. Now, we did see one Republican break a while ago. He broke such a big break. He's no longer a member of the party. So Justin Amash in Michigan.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so he did break off. But one thing is that balance, right? We talk about difficult votes when the representative is a different party than who the district wants for president. So there's 31 Democrats from Trump districts. There are only 3 Republicans from Clinton districts. So it's a total imbalance. It's not like there's 31 on the other side.
Yeah.
31 Republicans from Clinton districts. There's only 3. One of them is Representative Will Hurd out of southern Texas.
And he's retiring.
He's retiring, so his electoral calculations are done. He's not trying to think about he's got to vote with the Democrats because his district voted for Clinton. I mean, that's out of his head.
So he can do whatever he wants because he's not thinking about getting
He's not running for re-election. And if he's smart, he'd probably want to stay in good graces of the party. He may have some other good positions in his future. I think he's in his 40s still. So we have 2 others. There's only 2 other districts. New York's 24th has Representative Katko, and then Pennsylvania's first has Representative Fitzpatrick. So it's a 2 versus 31 that are in tough situations in that House. So I think Pelosi's definitely going forward with these articles of impeachment in the House. And we've seen, Dr. Kabala, we've seen final articulation out of the Judiciary Committee about what these articles are. And it's boiled down to 2. Now, we've heard lots of different words thrown out. Yeah, go
chime in with one other question. It's interesting to me, substance aside, the substance of the charges aside, the contrast with the 1990s impeachment of Bill Clinton, when you did see a number of Republicans, when you did see a number of Democrats, I think it was 20-something, break and join a Republican majority in the House to impeach, that contrast stands out to me as you think about these moderate Democrats who might be having second thoughts today about moving forward. It's again, substance aside, it's a different political calculation.
Yeah, and we discussed the Johnson impeachment before the break, and the Clinton impeachment it's more fresh in people's minds. Right. A lot of people were around following it then, but it was rather different procedurally. There was an independent counsel investigation. Right. Clinton was involved in grand jury testimony and court cases in the judicial branch in courts of law, and the independent counsel found that he had committed perjury and obstruction of justice, and that had been conclusively documented in the report. Right. So there was kind of like an admission of a crime. It just wasn't sure if that crime had anything to do with his office of the presidency or if impeachment was conviction and removal was warranted, given that the crimes were about trying to cover up an affair he had.
I mean, I think Newt Gingrich himself has expressed some regret, said he had second thoughts today looking back politically on how Republicans handled that. But notwithstanding, that was a bipartisan effort compared to the current one. You had something like 20-odd Democrats join the Republican majority in voting to impeach. Just a thought that I had.
Yeah, very good. And it's just so opposite from the current one. So with the Clinton one, we definitely have crime. It's just a question of it's not negatively harming the national interest, quote unquote. Yep. Where here in the Trump one, there's no crime, but there's a claim that he's acting against the national interest.
That overlap.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite. So what we have here is 2 charges. One is called abuse of power. And what's interesting here is there's no claim that there was a crime involved. They're linking 2 separate things. The president requested to the president of Ukraine that he look into Burisma, maybe Hunter Biden's involvement, a natural gas company in the Ukraine. Also, that the president look into any Ukrainian involvement in the 2016 election. So there's some request for information that's documented on the call. And then they're saying that the president withheld 2 things. One, a White House meeting. So my understanding, there's no crime. The president doesn't have to give anyone a White House meeting. He kind of decides who he meets with. Sure. And then the president withheld $391 million in aid that Congress had authorized, security aid for Ukraine. But of course, as I've highlighted in some of those op-eds, and we discussed on this show a little bit in previous weeks, the president is allowed to do that according to the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. He's allowed to temporarily defer funds within the fiscal year, which ran through September 30th. He released the funds before the end of the fiscal year. So what's interesting is as the Democrats have talked about up to the point, they were suggesting there was some statutory law that he had violated. In these articles of impeachment, we don't see it, but we do see that they're saying he did the request for investigations in terms of he's going to withhold the meeting or the funds until he gets the investigation. And that kind of, his combination of those decisions
conveyed a certain,
had quote unquote, and this is page 3, line 24 of the articles of impeachment, had quote unquote corrupt motives. Okay. So it's not that he tried to exercise authority he didn't have, but that his motives were corrupt in combining 2 separate decisions that he made. Okay. Any thoughts?
And it's going, well, and motive is so much harder to prove, right, than an actual action or a concrete policy step. I find myself wondering about that. So the motive, I mean, has that ever been done before. I don't think that's ever been attempted as part of a impeachment inquiry, even in criminal and civil matters. A motive, I mean, it's relevant, but other factors have to be decisive, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so we hear and it's actually articulated here that his motive is to damage his 2020 political opponent, Joe Biden. But Trump's going to be very easily say, no, my motive was to find out something, to look into something going on in Ukraine in 2014, 2016 that strike me as curious.
Right.
And it's not a question of whether Joe Biden or Hunter Biden did anything wrong, but did President Trump think there was something to look into? And
sure.
It's going to be very easy for him to make that case.
And I would think there's two kinds of quid pro quos here. I'm curious how this plays in the Senate. There's a personal quid pro quo where it seems to me Democrats would clearly be on stronger ground. But then there's a policy quid pro quo, and this happens all the time in legislatures, in government. If I take this policy step, the other side takes another policy step. That's a totally legitimate quid pro quo, right? So I guess the question is, in terms of how the case proceeds in the Senate, are we talking about a personal quid pro quo? Or are we talking about a professional policy-related exchange? Because the policy-related exchange, and I think Jonathan Turley was getting at this, that's a thinner case if Democrats want to go there.
Yeah, I do think you're right. And also this question of that he's doing it for personal interest, not national interest. I don't know if there's concern about someone serving on a son of a vice president serving on a board making $50,000 a month. Right. And this is kind of curious. You can make a case that his request to get to the bottom of it, quote unquote, is in the national interest. And if it happens to help his electoral campaign, that's like coincidental or something like that. I give an analogy of, if the U.S. is in a war and the president asks another country to be an ally in the war, right. They do, we win the war, and by golly, the USA is happy and we win the next election. Do we have national interest and personal?
Well, there's that overlap, and there's the question with the personal overlaps with policy related. There's the question of optics. There's the question of, is it a high crime or misdemeanor? So is the abuse of power, in your estimation, speaking directly to that motive, or what is abuse of power in the charge referring to?
Yeah, well, it's kind of legitimizing that he has the power to make these decisions, but right. Saying that he's abusing them because he has corrupt personal motivations, and they're telling us Joe Biden's his political opponent in 2020. That'd be news to me. He doesn't have a delegate to the convention yet.
Yeah.
Nor was I ever thinking Joe Biden's going to be the nominee. I was expecting this not to happen. I'm expecting someone else to be the nominee the whole time.
And you've had the superdelegate rule change, so if Joe Biden wants to go that route, that's harder this time around.
But I get that not everyone agrees with me. Some people think Biden is going to be the nominee, and maybe some people think Trump's intentions weren't good. It's not clear. I mean, it's up for interpretation. Mm-hmm. It's up for what was he thinking? Not what decision did he made? What was his motive behind the decision? And it's just going to be very hard to prove that in a court of law, especially on the testimony we've seen. Someone like Sondland. Mm-hmm. So Sondland, Ambassador Sondland, he's the ambassador to the EU. He was the high point for Democrats when it came to the House public hearings because he actually talked to the president directly. Other people were hearsay evidence. And he said when it came to the White House meeting, he had an understanding through Giuliani that President Trump wasn't going to give a meeting unless there were investigations, not of Biden in 2020, but of Ukraine's interference in 2016 and the Burisma Corporation. Sure. They said, you mean the Bidens? He said, no, I never heard Biden. I heard Burisma. Yep. But he did connect it to the White House meeting.
Yep.
But when it came to the funds, he said, I called President Trump directly. Said, hey, what do you need for the funds? He said to me, President Trump says, I need nothing. I don't want anything. Tell them to do the right thing. Yeah. No quid pro quo. Yeah. And that was like their best witness.
Which is interesting, yeah. I said the same thing to people. I thought Gordon Sondland clearly went beyond hearsay, and I think Ken Starr, before Gordon Sondland made that point about no actual quid pro quo in terms of finances, in terms of aid, Ken Starr makes a point about, okay, maybe people will flip in the Senate, but then Gordon Sondland adds that piece that you just mentioned, and the picture changes a little bit.
It totally changes. And the best they had is that Sondland believed through Giuliani he wanted something for a White House meeting. They had nothing on the funds. Mm-hmm. And the whole media narrative has been he withheld funds. The public does not want to impeach this president because he didn't give someone a White House meeting. You know,
Yeah,
it seems like the funds are the more bigger thing where the public sentiment is there. The media is driving the narrative.
Yep.
And they had no evidence linking that. The White House meeting, we had whatever Sondland provided. There was something there, but Americans don't want to impeach on a White House meeting, which is one of my points about this abuse of power case. Instead of 2 articles of impeachment on abuse of power, 1, he withheld a meeting. 2, he withheld funds. They've combined them. And it kind of traps the voters in the House and the Senate because the evidence for meeting is different than the evidence for the funds, and yet it's packaged together. They got a yes or no on this kind of packaged deal.
So it's getting a little convoluted, which just in terms of strategy seems like it complicates the issue for Democrats. Whatever happened to the bribery possibility? Wasn't that being considered as one of the articles at one point? Seems like that's fallen by the wayside.
We saw extortion, we saw bribery, they've fallen by the wayside. I think the money's going in the wrong direction for bribery. This isn't about Trump getting money, you know. This is about him requesting to get to the bottom of something, and we have a treaty with Ukraine on these matters. So it seems like, and of course, we know our listeners disagree. We have a variety of listeners. These are just our humble takes on what we're seeing, but eventually there's going to be votes. I mean, and eventually history is going to look back on this. So eventually the other people will be able to weigh in. The other charge we have here is obstruction of Congress. Very interesting, Dr. Kabala, because it is not obstruction of justice. It's obstruction of Congress. Any thoughts before I add to that?
Well, I would think obstruction of justice is the stronger case to make. I'm wondering why Democrats have chosen not to make it. We have an example in the Johnson impeachment in the 1860s of Congress being wrong. The Supreme Court later ruled in the 1920s that Congress had overstepped its prerogatives in attempting to thwart a president from exercising control over the cabinet. So I wonder about that. Why aren't Democrats making the more confident-sounding obstruction of justice case here? Parts of government, branches of government can be wrong. They have been. So that's a question mark for me, too. I wonder about that.
I believe there is no obstruction of justice charge because they never went to the courts. The reason President Trump didn't comply or have his White House or have his executive branch agencies comply with all the subpoenas is because he claimed a right of executive privilege, that the executive deliberations are important to national security, and there's a precedent for executive privilege that the courts have ruled over time. Pelosi is saying that's he's obstructing. And when Pelosi originally announced, she said by going to the courts, he's obstructing justice. Now we see they've changed obstructing Congress because, as you know even better than me, Dr. Kabala, there is nothing in the Constitution that says executive privilege. That's a precedent the courts have established over time. But again, there's also nothing in the Constitution that grants Congress subpoena power. That's also from the courts. The courts have kind of established both of these norms, the Congress having subpoena power, the president being able to exert executive privilege in cases. The court is the arbiter of those things. And because the House has not taken up this fight between Trump on executive privilege or not in the courts, they have no good case on obstruction of justice. If they wanted an obstruction of justice, they should have won that court battle, and then if Trump didn't comply, charge him with obstruction of justice. But because that court battle over executive privilege never took place, it just rests as an obstruction of Congress charge.
Interesting. And certainly there's tension between the branches historically. There's a disagreement even when it comes to judicial review, which I've done some work on. Are all 3 branches of government responsible for exercising their judgment when it comes to what's constitutional or not? Is it just the Supreme Court? I will say I've mentioned some areas where I think optically the Democrats haven't helped themselves. I think when President Trump's lawyers argue that inherent executive privilege is unlimited, we've heard that claim made. William Barr has also done some research to that effect. Optically, my bet is that might be a weaker point for the president when President Trump says there are no inherent limitations whatsoever, but I think it could be a wash.
Well, I mean, you'd need a court to say, no, you don't, this is the line. And then if he doesn't comply with that line, you'd have an obstruction of justice charge. But they say, we can't wait. We can't go through the court process. We've got to go now because he's such a threat to national security. We have to remove him and bar him from office,
right.
Which is kind of a funny argument to me when no one actually thinks he's going to be removed.
Interesting.
And
especially independence. It's interesting to me going forward to consider what the political dynamic is in some of these battleground states. I'm sure you saw the Esquire article recently pointing out that over the last month, support among independents for impeaching, removing the president has gone down dramatically, something like 10 points. So this is not a Wall Street Journal, National Review article. This is Esquire saying this is a warning for Democrats going into 2020. Be aware. It seems like the key constituency that Democrats need to regain, independence in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, is falling away. So I wonder about that. Do you have any thoughts about strategic implications?
Yeah, I think in a Senate trial, we're going to be able to see the rules changed, control changed back to the Republicans. Yeah. We have this an article out here about how right now there's discussions between the Trump team and Mitch McConnell, a majority leader in the Senate, about the format of this trial and taking place. I do think that once you go through the trial with a Republican-controlled Senate, and this is an interesting point, the previous impeachments, the same party had House and Senate. Mm-hmm. And this is the first time we've seen one party controlling the House, sending it to a Senate by the other party where the rules change. So the rules are going to change. Trump is going to be able to have a more favorable environment here, which to present his case. The narrative will thus change on it, and he's not going to be convicted or removed. So he's going to be able to say he was vindicated by the Senate. Looks like 2020, this will be good for President Trump to wrap this up through this Senate process.
And the disagreement you think is in terms of call witnesses or not in the Senate? Is that what separates Donald Trump from Mitch McConnell?
Yeah, there seems to be, Trump would like a more full trial to make his case, not only to the senators, I think to the voters. Yeah. And Mitch McConnell and some senators are saying, as soon as we know we got the votes on this, let's just wrap this up.
Interesting.
And a third of the senators are also up for re-election. They have to get back to their districts and campaign. At least a third of them. Only a third of them are up for a vote. So we're looking at how that's going to play out. How's the vote going to go? So we talked about maybe the format here, but Democrats have 47 senators. Republicans have 53. But that's the simple math. Not all Republicans are from very Republican states like Texas. Not all Democrats are from Democratic states. Right. I look right away. I look at Joe Manchin in West Virginia. That's a very Trump state. He's a Democrat from a very Trump state. That's a tough vote.
Sure.
Doug Jones in Alabama from a very Trump state. Very tough vote. What do you think?
I agree. Certainly, Senator Manchin, I don't see being enthusiastic about the process. Yeah, I really don't think Democrats in the Senate have a lock. Let's see what happens. But this is, again, that polling of independents to me suggests that a key constituency that Democrats need to recapture is just not on board.
It's a little early, but I'm thinking less than 47 votes to convict him in the Senate. Well, it's been great. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Kabala. We really appreciate it. Cogley and Morrow is on Facebook. We want our listeners to go there, like us. We also post interesting articles related to our conversations. We're also now on podcast formats throughout the internet. You can hear Cogley and Morrow on politics throughout wherever you get your podcast feeds. We have lots of previous episodes. We look forward to that. We're wishing all of our listeners a good week. We'll be back next week with Dr. Morrow in the studio. This is Cogley and Morrow on politics on KTRL 90.5 FM.